So I am going to be talking about William Charles Osman Hill. He wasn't a prosecutor, unfortunately. He was a prosector. So, but that's not a very common word at all, or career nowadays. It's a dying trade within the medical world, especially. So I will be talking a bit more about what prosection is. But first of all, I will just give you a very brief overview of Hill's, what he's most well known for. And I'm going to focus most on his time at ZSL, but I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to his career before this, because it's the reason for him becoming employed at ZSL. So Hill is most well known as a 20th century primatologist, as Mike mentioned. So he was really interested in a variety of different species, but his most famous work is this a series of 8 books. It's a monograph series on primates, comparative anatomy and taxonomy. And throughout his career, he collected a lot of specimens of all sorts of different species, and those that survive are at the RCS. They were bequeathed because he became a Hunterian trustee in his later years of life. And you can see the range of things here. So most of my research is actually focusing on the collection, but I'm not really going to be talking about the specimens today so much as Hill himself. So I'll just give you a very brief introduction to Hill's lead up to some of his sort of research. So he was born in 1901. He was a medic, so he did his medical degree at the University of Birmingham. At that time, like the previous century, there were still large components of zoology and comparative anatomy in training. And you can see from his career choices after graduating that he didn't want to practice medicine. He became a lecturer in zoology and a lecturer in anatomy at the University of Birmingham. And then in 1930, he makes quite a significant decision in his life to move to Sri Lanka to take up a post of Professor of Anatomy at what was called Ceylon Medical School there. You can see his day job would have been in lecture theatres. They had a museum collection as well, but he was essentially responsible for the anatomical examination and teaching of the students there. But in his downtime, he really got to indulge his interests in zoology. Sri Lanka provided this environment in which he could go out and collect and study species in the wild. And quite early on, he identified a new species of subspecies of the grey slender loris. And very early on, he also started to build up his own menagerie. And he grew this in the grounds or the gardens around his bungalow, which was in quite a bustling city, as he describes it at the time. And I think a lot of the passers-by found it quite surprising and sometimes alarming to come across these animals that were just separated by a fence or a cage in Colombo. So this impressive collection of both exotic and living native animals was a mixture of purchased animals, so he would buy them from animal traders such as Christopher Schwartz, and sailors that he would go specifically to the ports to meet and see what he could get and add to his collection. And it really shows through his publications that these are the things that he's interested in at that time. He's still carrying out studies in anatomy and physiology of non-humans, but he's very interested in the care of these in captivity, and this includes breeding in captivity as well. So lots of his publications are on this. And when he is writing about his menagerie, which he built up over the 15 years he was in Colombo, he says he comes across as very proud of this living collection. He describes, or boasts, you could say, that at one point his collection of langurs consisted of 7 species of leaf monkey, which was more than London Zoo had in its whole history. So he stays in Sri Lanka for most of the Second World War. At that time, his collection of living animals sort of decreases a little bit, and he's taking on the exotic pets of lots of people that are actually vacating the island because it's at risk of being invaded. And he eventually decides to leave himself. I think his day work there would have changed quite dramatically during this time. So in 1944, he makes plans to disperse his collection of animals. And this includes Patrick, a large olive baboon, and Bijou, a giant squirrel. So it's the last surviving member of the giant squirrel family that he cared for throughout these years. And he decides that these animals, along with some of the other more unusual species that he holds, should go to London Zoo. So they temporarily reside in Sri Lanka at Delaware Zoo for about 2 years before they finally make their way to London Zoo, and this is because of the difficulties with transporting animals during the war years. Hill himself, throughout all of this, has built up his own specimen collection as well. So although he's focused on the living animals, he's still adding to his dead collection too. So together with that collection, he comes back to the UK before his animals actually do. And back in Britain, he goes to University of Edinburgh. He's there for 5 years as a reader in anthropology. And I think we can really see from his time here that this is where his focus starts to become primarily on primates. And he's actually commissioned at this time to write that monograph series. So he does that most of the research for his very first book at his time in Edinburgh. And during this time, although it's not actually published till after he leaves Edinburgh, he credits ZSL for supporting his research. So they provided him with data, and they gave him special facilities to study living primates. So he'd come down to London Zoo to visit and study them. But they also provided him with the dead bodies of primates. They sent them up to Edinburgh so that he could dissect and study them there. So this provision of dead bodies was actually traditionally the role of the Prosector at ZSL. So Hill actually moves back to London, comes to London, and he takes up this position of Prosector in 1950. And I will give you a bit of an overview of what a Prosector actually is. So the post started in 1865, and it was started at the same time as the Prosectorium was established. This was also known as the Dead House. And the aim of this role was to investigate the deaths of animals that died in the zoo, but also to further scientific investigation. So this was essentially anatomical investigation of these animals. And the very first Prosector was a surgeon called James Murray. And he seemed to struggle with these two roles, these two aspects to his job. Abigail Woods has included a really nice discussion of James Murray in one of her book chapters, Doctors in the Zoo. And it really comes across that poor James Murray wasn't getting any recognition for this huge workload that he had. So his days would be spent trying to understand why animals died, as well as he was expected to publish this anatomical investigation. And you can see from some of the letters in the archives that he was trying to really get this across to the council at the time. He ends up leaving because he doesn't get success in having his workload reduced, so he resigns in 1871. And after that, his successors, I think there's about 3 of them, they spend very little time reporting on the reasons why the animals died and much more time writing about the scientific investigations. So they're very interested in the anatomy. And comparative anatomy is very of high importance at this time, and the ZSL recognises that. So in 1902, finally the council realised that this role should be split, and it makes sense to us today. Those two roles are generally quite separate, and so for a few years we had a Prosector. They would be responsible for carrying out anatomical investigations, but also preserving and preparing bodies or specimens to send to various institutions. So this includes museums as well as individual researchers. So the RCS, for example, has got lots of specimens that were sent from ZSL to them in lots of their collections. In 1925, the role of Prosector changes slightly, but only in job title, really. So it becomes Anatomical Research Fellow, possibly to do with funding. There's some famous names associated with this. So Zuckerman is one of these that holds this role for a few years, and he is described as a prosector. So he's taken on all of those anatomical responsibilities. And then we get our very first pathologist working in the zoo that is their focus, primarily just pathology and understanding why things have died. In 1937, the Anatomical Research Fellow, or the Prosector, is not renewed for some reason. It seems to come back for a few years, but primarily there's a much more focus on disease. So we see a bit of a change there. And the pathologist is having to provide specimens to these other institutions, but they're not carrying out anatomical research. So there's not as many publications on zoo animals associated with anatomical research from a fellow or a staff member at that time. And then in 1950, the Prosector comes back, and this is Osman Hill. And the only reason that a Prosector role is advertised is because the pathologist has left. So we're back to that very first sort of Prosector role where this individual is expected to understand both the disease of the animals as well as carry out anatomical investigation. And this announcement in the Daily Telegraph at the time really highlights the fact that Hill is responsible. He's essentially carrying out the pathological duties in the zoo. So, like the first Prosector, Hill does have a heavy workload. There are 1,217 deaths in the first year that he's in the zoo, and he's expected to report on these. He's carrying out pathological sample analysis, but not just of the dead animals. He does it for any new acquisitions as well as any sick animals, and he's expected to advise on their care and treatment. So his work with that living collection in Sri Lanka has really sort of enhanced this role. And really, the only reason he's got employed in this is because of his anatomy background, but thankfully he's got this understanding of, or at least some understanding of living animals as well. So he's also responsible for sending the specimens off to support these other institutions. And just to give you an idea of what the Prosectorium was like at the time, so it housed both the pathology and the post-mortem labs. It's described as having the walls lined with specimens. So if you ever come to the RCS and see the museum there, you'll see we have a lot of fluid preserved specimens, and this is what the Prosectorium was like at the time. Outside of it stood these great tanks which were lead lined, and they contained formaldehyde, which is where the larger animals were preserved. So there's notes on alligators and pygmy hippos being stored in these tanks. And thankfully there was a Prosector assistant helping Hill to move and preserve some of these animals. He was also expected to carry out his own original investigations, and as I'll show, he does this in a fantastic way. He continues to publish his Primates books. I think 5 of them get published whilst he's at ZSL, so he's really fulfilling that duty. And one of his other duties, which is very random, is he's responsible for supervising the first aid tent. So that that original first aid medical training has come into its own finally. So just to give you an idea of what Hill was like, he in terms of his skill set, there's this wonderful quote from one of his colleagues, Richard Fiennes, who shows Hill's dissection skill set, essentially. So he says, to see Osman Hill dissecting is a great experience, like a fairy waving her wand with a few deft and well-placed strokes of the scalpel. He will lay bare what he wants to show, and all becomes clear as a pikestaff. He says, this is the most impressive gift given to great anatomists. And these 2 images here are actually by Hill's wife, Yvonne, who did most of the illustrations for his work. With prosection, we still have prosectors in medical schools. It is a bit of a dying trade, sadly, but it's much more than dissection. You're not dissecting a body just to study it. You need to be able to demonstrate what you're showing. In this case, he would have dissected or prosected down to certain levels to show certain anatomical structures so that his wife could translate it into these illustrations. And then he would describe it as well in text. So Fiennes also gives this wonderful description of Hill in another quote, which he says, one of the more curious specimens I ever saw was Osman Hill himself, on the occasion when a hippopotamus had died the night before. It had died in the night in a very warm house, and its entire carcass was a virtual culture of Clostridium welki. It stank to high heaven. However, perched on the tympanic stomach of the hippo with his legs crossed like a Buddha in the abdominal cavity was Osman Hill, smiling happily and peacefully in his best working suit. It says, at last, at the really great moments of life, one never has a camera in one's hand. And so this is AI's interpretation of that quote. But this job was not necessarily up everybody's street. It's a very smelly job, but he was so passionate. And we can see this in the collection and the range of things that he adds to it. So there is a variety of species, but we also have his interests in cryptozoology. So we have Yeti feces, for example, because he was involved in studies of that at the time. So he's a passionate man. So after about 6 to 7 years of working and juggling both these roles, the council finally appoints another pathologist. And I don't know if this was in part because of the recognition of the workload. It does coincide with the new animal hospital, which had its own pathology labs opening up, and it became fully operational around the same time, so maybe this helped. Maybe the fact that Hill is publishing profusely during these years is really showing how ZSL is linked to this in scientific investigation and anatomy. But it frees up Hill's time. He remains in charge of the Prosectorium, and he's able to just focus on anatomical research and supporting others, so people would come to the Prosectorium to study as well as receiving specimens. And he's also able to start sort of sharing and teaching. So he holds visiting lecture posts. So he's a visiting professor at Emory University, for example, which is where Yerkes' Regional Primate Centre is based. But he's still asked for advice on the care and treatment of animals, so he still gets to retain this element and this side of his interests. And this is just one of the more unusual patients that he had to advise on, I suppose. So this is a 5.5-foot worm nicknamed Gertrude, which made her way over from the Colombian Andes to London Zoo, and Hill was advising on how she should be handled and stored at this time. So he wants her to be left alone for a couple of days once she arrives at the zoo. These are amazing creatures. I don't know very much about her, but if you look them up, they're really impressive. They're basically giant earthworms. So, Hill writes about 220 or plus scientific publications during his life, so he publishes a lot, and 92 of those are while he's at ZSL, which includes 5 primate books, 2 other books on various subjects. And particularly in his primates work, he says he's indebted to ZSL in being able to carry out this research. So the zoo would actually acquire certain species for him to study in life, and then the dead animals within the Prosectorium would provide data that he said would actually not be able to be collected in the field. When you're looking at anatomy, often preserved tissue becomes distorted in some ways, so you can't describe it as accurately as you would with a sort of fresh body. So considering that he's got these amazing advances, he's finally got his time to focus on this as well, and he's getting the support of the zoo in doing so. It's quite surprising that in 1962 he decides to resign. I don't know exactly why this is. The zoo retains the pathologist role. There's not a prosector reappointed, and it coincides around the same time with the Institute of Zoology opening up. We also have, in the the following few years the Nuffield Institute of Comparative Medicine and the Wellcome Institute of Comparative Physiology. Both of these are masterminded by Solly Zuckerman, who is really taking research away from that single individual getting to do it. Maybe this is the reason. I actually got to interview somebody that considered Hill to be his mentor during life, and he said that they were actually working difficulties with Zuckerman. I haven't found any evidence of this, but if anybody knows anything, I'd be really interested to hear about it. Whether the post would have continued if Hill had stayed, he had no interest in retiring. By the looks of things, he was 4 years off of retirement officially at this point, but he leaves ZSL and he moves to Atlanta, and he takes up a post as associate director at Yertz's Regional Primate Center. And he stays there until he's 68, so he's still, really, really active. When he does finally retire, he doesn't stop working. He publishes 2 more volumes of the Primate series. He semi-drafts the manuscript for volume 9, and he continues to lecture and acts as a trustee for the museum. So, sadly, he dies in 1975, and he leaves his unfinished manuscript, which sadly his wife, who dies a year later, tries to finish but doesn't. And so just to conclude on his legacy, so we have his specimen collection, which I said I wouldn't really talk about, and I haven't, but it's his books that have remained the sort of his legacy and have had a lasting impact. And his taxonomy within this, particularly within the primate world, remained a baseline for nearly 3 decades, so it's quite influential. There are still aspects of primate anatomy where current modern-day primatologists are saying they're the best descriptions they've got available. And you can see this from this citation chart where the books, as well as some of these other publications, are continuing to be cited today, so they're an ongoing anatomy reference. And it's ZSL's influence in this that's enabled this work to continue. So not only do we see a strong link between that very first prosector and the very last prosector, but we see the contributions that ZSL made in enabling this sort of this lasting impact within primate anatomy to take place. So thank you very much.